Good afternoon. I will begin class in about 1 minute. Or 2 minutes. I'm letting people in still. Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. Let's see. Welcome to the folks just getting connected. Good to see your pictures. Those of you who have pictures of your names. As you know, I always encourage you, or you're welcome to take your do your camera, but if not, I've gotten used to just saying your names and rocking and rolling and going for the class. All right. Well, and as of like before class started, maybe about a half an hour ago, I know that at least 7 of you have submitted your essays already, which is wonderful. It's great. It's not due till midnight tonight or 11:59 tonight. So that way you get all your stuff in, and we get through the poetry essay, and you'll be good. So if at the end of class, if there's any questions, I'm going to pause and give a couple minutes after class if anybody have any last minute questions. But if people are good, last class people seem to be good, so I hope, and the fact that 7 students have already submitted the papers, that's great. We're in a good place. So again, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class today. Today we begin a new section of the class. We begin today with exploring fiction. And so a lot of times, just even in the chat, I'll unmute yourself. I'm just going to begin with, when you hear the word fiction, right? What comes to mind? And put it in the chat or unmute yourself. Like when you hear fiction, what comes to mind? Just
science fiction.
Science fiction, Alan? Okay.
Yes.
What about science fiction?
Like the movies, the literature.
Okay. Yep. So science fiction is definitely a genre in fiction. Any others? Not real, perhaps fantasy or fake. Yes, things that are not real, Carlene. Lindsay says something fake, not real, and so did Catherine. Yeah, imaginary. Yeah, definitely, Ramit, imaginary. That is, all of you are on the right track of creating what is in the realm of fiction, right? So now when you look at your Blackboard, when you go to Blackboard, there's a new little folder that says fiction in it. So inside of there, it's going to be a handout that I'm going to go over in the beginning part of this class. And then I'll speak about the assignment that's due on by class time, by like noon on Wednesday, for you to answer the questions from a little story that we're going to read today, to introduce you, to give you a little taste of some fiction. And then there'll be one other story that you will need to read before class next time, and then answer a question, and we'll talk about that story then. Okay, but you're on the right track. And so I'm going to share my screen. One moment. And actually, I think I'm going to take you through the steps just so we're all clear. All right. So here we go. So I'm in our class. If you go to course content, now there's a little fiction folder on top. Inside of the folder, if you click it, right, you'll see elements of fiction overview, which is what we're going to be a handout now. And then here, there's a bunch of different short stories that are going to be in the class. There's a lot of short stories in here, and not all of the short stories will, we will read all of them, but I think we will read most of them in the order that they're in here so far. And then but we'll see what we'll get to. All right, we may add some, we may switch some out, but just follow along with class, and I'll let you know which ones to read. So I'm going to click. I'm not going to click because I already have it open. So, oh wait, maybe I don't. Here, yes. So if I click this, I'll just click it so you can see. And I apologize, my computer has been slow all day. It's in the middle of doing something. All right, but I'll just click that. So here we go with elements of fiction. So I started asking you all what you thought of what fiction was. And you said things like imaginary, fake, not real, science fiction, all of those things right on track, right? So, so here's just a little bit of background and history on fiction. So definitely there's fiction. I'm not at the handout, I'm still talking to so certainly there's fiction, and there's something called nonfiction, right? And I always have an issue with nonfiction because it's not a thing, it's a non-something, it's something else. But nonfiction is really true stories, right? So if somebody's writing a story that is nonfiction, what you are relying on that storyteller is for them to be telling the truth about real events that happened, and there's no altering the outcomes or what happens in the events. In my creative writing class, an exercise that I sometimes give my students is to write a story about something that happened, but you know what? Change the ending, right? Like, and I get stories of students write stories of loves that didn't work out proper, didn't work out the way they wanted. Um, okay, so thank you, Viviano, and thank you, Catherine, for taking care of the class and each other. So yeah, if we have any issues with sound, let me know, okay? Because I could also put my headphones on if I can find them. I just couldn't find them before class, but sometimes that helps. But so if that's what you're relying on, you're relying on a nonfiction writer to be telling you the truth. So an exercise that I do in my fiction book, in my writing class sometimes, is I'll give that to students, right? I'll tell them to write a story and to change the outcome, right? So in real life, it happened this way, but if you could make your own story, how would you like that to happen? So students have written stories about winning the lotto. Students have written stories about one time they went on a trip that, didn't go well in real life, but then they made it amazing, of loves, of somebody that broke their heart, but then the person comes back to them. People, unfortunately, have written tough stories about, sometimes losing a baby, and what the life would be like if they had the baby. So so different types of ways, but that would be fiction, would be changing the ending. Even though everything else before it was true, changing the ending would make that story fictional. Yeah, Viviana, you have a question? No. Okay. So I will continue. So if we look here, is what is fiction? It's a term used to classify any story created by the imagination rather than based strictly on history or fact, though it may be based on a true story or situation. Types of literature in the fiction genre include the novel, short story, and novella, right? And fiction, and so basically a novel is something that is, I should say, like 140 pages or more. A novella, a short story is less. A short story can be anywhere from like a couple of pages to like, 20, 25 pages. And then novellas are, works that are in between a short story and a novel. So that's talking about length, right? There's different types. Here's a few. There's like the myth, there's a romance stories, there's fables, fantasy, detective stories, mysteries, science fiction, as one of your classmates said. Alan, I believe, romance, fantasy, chick lit, literature that's specifically for women. There's a genre called chick lit, crime thrillers, historical fiction, urban myths, horror stories, and more. Now, I say historical fiction, and earlier in the definition, it didn't talk about, it said it could be based on, it's not based on strictly history or fact, right? And so what would a historical fiction be? Historical fiction sometimes looks like this. There's a story that's set, let's say you write a story set during the corona virus pandemic, right? So the coronavirus pandemic is true. It happened in 2020 into 2021. There are elements about the story that could be true and based on a particular time in history, but the characters are not. You make up the characters, you make up the situation. You can write a story about a mother who gets COVID and how her daughter, who's 10 years old, has to take care of her, and whatever. But those characters are what you've made up, but you've set them in a historical moment. And there's markers in the things that really talk about the history, but through these characters. So essentially, you're right. The word fiction, right, comes from the act of making, the Latin word fixio. And that's the act of making, fashioning, or molding. You're crafting and creating. So, do you not craft and create a nonfiction story? Do you not craft and create a poem? So what makes this in particular? So what separates the act of crafting a short story or fiction from poetry? And so the next section are the three things, the three main elements that every fictional story should have, right? And they should have what I list here as plot, character, and setting, right? It should be those three things: plot, character, and setting. Okay. Just taking, I just check at the chat every now and then just to make sure people don't have a question. but feel free to chat with each other and about what we're talking about, not random things. But yes, right. So it's plot, character, and setting, right? Place or setting, but setting's a more accurate word because setting is not only about place, right? So the plot, right? The plot of the story, the plot is not just telling the story. It's not like, I can tell you a story of how I began class, right? I made coffee in case I wanted something to sip. Sometimes I also have water in case I have something, I want something to drink. And then I sat down and then I opened up your Blackboard and I saw who did this. And then I opened up the Zoom and then I signed in and then I waited a minute and then two, and then I let people, that's me just telling you the series of events, right? That's different than plot. Plot deals with cause and effect, right? It's about the action in the story. So in my handout, I write here in this middle section and a description, the second paragraph here. um, if the author writes the king died and then the queen died, there is no plot for a story, right? It's just telling you one thing happened and another thing happened. But by writing the king died and the queen died of grief, the writer has provided a plot line for the story, a cause, the king dying, and the effect, the queen dying of grief because the king died, right? So then suddenly there's a cause and effect. So when we talk about plot, we talk about things that move the action forward, things that have a consequence, things that have an effect, right, in the story. If the story begins with a car crash, right, and someone in the car crash is killed, and the story is being told from the perspective of maybe one of the children who wasn't in the car, right? They That car crash has an effect on that person's life, right? It's a plot element because it's going to move the action forward. It might ignite the action in the story, right? Another way to think of plot is to think of like why things happen, right? Not only the what is happening, but why, right? So simply a plot structure is the way in which a story elements are arranged, right? So how this happens, how the writer is deciding when to set up the series of events, right? Um, if people haven't seen this, The Wizard of Oz, which is a movie that is an old movie that was made in 1939, but is considered a classic. And a lot of people know Wicked, the Broadway play, because it was based on the story of the two witches of The Wizard of Oz. But the story of The Wizard of Oz, I put this here, is that it follows, the plot elements could be followed as this. A tornado picks up a house, drops it on a witch. A little girl meets some interesting traveling companions. A wizard sends them on a mission, and they melt the witch with a bucket of water. Right after the right that. So if you don't know the story, those are kind of like major elements that something happens and it moves the action forward. For example, in a mystery, the author will withhold plot exposition until later in the story. So in a mystery, very often what happens right at the beginning. There's a missing child, there's a dead person, there is a stolen object, right? So that happens, and then how that happens unfolds. There's a search for that, a search for a criminal, a search for the child, a search for something. So something right up front, and then the plot, the hows, right, and the whys come after. So story is the full sequence of events in a work of fiction as we imagine them to have taken place in the order which they would have occurred in life. This happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, etc. So story isn't the same as plot, but plot can be inside the story. Okay. So I'm gonna stop sharing for a moment. Yes. Crime shows have lit mysteries as their plot. Okay. So we talked about plot. I'm going to share my screen again because I think I hit the button incorrectly. I was just checking the chat. So we talked about plot. The other element of plot of a story of fiction are characters, right? So the characters, of course, are the people. It's wild to teach this because I would be asking you a lot more questions, but I feel like I'm doing a lot more telling. But at any moment, remember that child on the platform. I don't want you, if I'm moving too fast through this material, please feel free to say, could you explain that, professor, or slow down, or I didn't understand what you meant by plot. Could you say a little more about plot? So I'm going to take a minute to just, pause and see if anyone has questions about plot before I move on to characters. Okay. All right. So then we will move on to characters. So the characters, most people will say, of course, those are the people in the in the story, right? But it's yes, and you're right, it is the people. But characters can also be animals, characters can be objects, characters can be places, you know. There's an amazing book called A Parting the Waters. Um, and I'm not sure of the title, but it's Bernice McFadden. And I'm looking around to see if I have her book here, which I was on. I should have gotten McFadden. There's the letters M down there somewhere. All right, but I'm not going to spend more time looking for Bernice's book. Um, A Gathering of Waters. That's what it's called. A Gathering of Waters by Bernice McFadden. And it's told from the perspective of the town, right? The town is telling the story. The town is called Money, Mississippi, and it begins, I am Money, Mississippi. And then it talks about the whole history. Just imagine the perspective that that town has, right? Just imagine, look, if the Bronx could tell a story, right? And if the Bronx was telling the story, it would say the first time when the Lenape Indians came to its land and began walking and settling up, you know, places near, Hunts Point and Kips Bay, and how they did that. And then settlers came, and then the Bronxes moved to the Bronx and created their homes, because the borough's named after a family called Bronx, Jonas Bronk. And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the building of Yankee Stadium. The Bronx could talk about everything, because the land has always been here, right? So that's a amazing perspective. So the Bronx could be a character. So in that book, A Gathering of Waters, by Bernice McFadden, she used the town of Money, Mississippi, to tell a story. And I'll talk more about that story later when we talk about point of view. So in a story, the same way we did with poetry, right? When we did poetry, ultimately you learn language so you can talk about poetry, right? You learn things like stanzas, you learn things about similes, you learn things about rhyme schemes. So you attained vocabulary and skills to be able to talk about a poem beyond I liked it, right? That's important, right? Whether you liked it or not and why you liked it or not, that's important. But you were developing skills to be able to discuss poetry beyond what you like and what you understand, right? You were able to find out poetic elements and ideas. You were able to talk about themes, etc. So plot and characters are two ways that you can talk about fiction, right? They're two ways that you can write about fiction, right? Because it's a writing class. So eventually, you will write an essay on it. And what we're going to do now with fiction is build on what we did with poetry. Okay, so with fiction, characters is one way we can talk about them. So we talk about, they can be animals, they can be places, they can be objects. There's a story that my other class reads, called The Happy Prince, and it's really a story between a statue and a bird, right? And they're having this conversation and this interaction, but it's the characters are a statue, which you would think is an inanimate object, and a bird, right? That's a little creature, right? The bird before that was in love with a reed, which is a plant. So it's just that's by Oscar Wilde, and many of you are like scratching your heads and saying, wow, that sounds like an interesting story. And if anybody really wants it, I can send it to you. But that's called The Happy Prince. So in that story, the characters are not necessarily people. There are people in it, but the two main characters are a statue and a bird. So in stories, there's ways you can talk about characters, right? So one way is you can say the major character or the main character, right? The central character. And those are vital to the development and resolution of the conflict. We'll talk more about conflict later, right? So the major character is the character to whom most of the activity is happening to. Very often, if there's an impact or change, is really centered around that character. And so we call that character a major character. Another way I'm going to talk about that, you can say that character is a protagonist in the story, like the main character is the protagonist in the story. So I want you to think about that. So if there are major characters, there must be minor characters. And of course, there are minor characters in the story as well. But because a character is a minor character, it doesn't mean, what about Mary, Sue's, or Marty's? Okay. So Alan, I may ask you to say more about your comment, but right now I'm going to continue. So a minor character, right, could be Just because the word minor is there doesn't mean that they're unimportant, right? Minor just means that they have a different role in the story, right? They may be a supporting role, they may appear just in one moment for an important moment and then they're gone, for a particular purpose. So there's minor characters. There's the idea of a dynamic character. And sometimes the word dynamic sounds like fabulous, amazing, wow, but it doesn't mean that here in this context. It doesn't mean that in other contexts. But in here, a dynamic character is a character that begins in one place and then changes over time, right? Has a big change over time. So an example, there's a book called Push that they made a movie based on it called Precious, right? So the book Push, in it you meet Precious Jones, and she's this young woman who is, you know, um, she's almost illiterate. She's had one baby. She's pregnant with another one. She has a mother who's abusive, and she later learns she's HIV infected later on in the story. But she's a young woman that's going through a lot. And by the end of the story, I'm going to fast forward, she completely changes. She leaves that abusive mother, like the mother, like our mother. If our mothers are supposed to love us, right? But in this case, the mother was not doing that. The mother was actually horrible to her, but she found the courage and the strength to leave her mother. She ends up going to school. She ends up learning to read and becoming and writing poetry. And she ends up, figuring out how to take care of herself and her kids. So she began in this really small, oppressed, abusive situation, and was able to educate herself and move forward. That's an example of a dynamic character. So the character is dynamic and they change a lot. There's also the opposite, right? There's a major character, a minor character. They can be dynamic characters and they can be static characters. Characters that don't really change. If I make the reference to the Wizard of Oz again, the Wicked Witch of the West is wicked from the minute you meet the Wicked Witch to the end of the story when she's melted, right? So she never changes, right? Her character, but her character is a really important character in the book, right? So that's an example of that she's not a major character, she's a supporting character, but she is um, a static character. So static doesn't necessarily mean bad. Having a static character could be a bad thing if your character, if that's not the point of the story. An example of another static character comes from a movie called Forrest Gump. And if anybody has seen Forrest Gump, there's a movie that this man, from the time he's a child to he's adult, witnesses this incredible spread of history, right? But he also kind of stays like the same person. You saw that movie? Okay, great. Yeah, so Forrest Gump is always this kind of simple, almost like doesn't know what he gets into from beginning to the end, right? So he will be another example of a static character. You love that movie. Yeah, it's a great movie. It's a great soundtrack too for Forrest Gump. For those of you who could get into 60s and 70s music. So then we have a round character. Those are characters that are complex. We have flat characters. Again, they're not necessarily as complex. Like the evil witch could also be a flat character. Like she is just evil, and that's how she is, And then there's stock characters, and these are kind of almost like stereotypical characters. That exemplify a stereotype. And some of them, they call them, like one example is the femme fatale, and that the femme means woman, F-E-M-M-E, and fatale means like, it could be like deadly. That's what it means, fatale, to be fatal. But it's in those crime detective novels, those like femme fatales are like those sexy women that are beautiful and they always lure men into trouble. Or there is the kind of crazy professor that is wild, like in the Back to the Future movies, the kind of insane professor. They could be comedic, but they could, the idea that there's insane, there's the sidekick, like for every Batman, there's a Robin, for every Lone Ranger, there's a Tonto, the sidekick, the person for every Don Quixote, there's a Pancho Villa. Um, there's always this comparison between the sidekick could be like is a kind of and they're supportive, they help them, and etc. So then I mentioned there's the protagonist, and the protagonist is usually the main character, the central character, and the protagonist usually wants something. They want freedom, they want to get married, they want something, right? They want respect from and there's something, and the antagonist gets in the way, right? They try to stop what the antagonist wants. The antagonist is always stopping them, right? So and if we use the Wizard of Oz, Dorothy, who ends up in Oz, wants to go home. That's what she wants. She wants to get back to her home. And the witch is always trying to prevent her from getting home. She puts obstacles. She makes it snow. She almost burns the scarecrow. She's always doing things. She steals the dog, kidnaps him, and kidnaps Dorothy as well. So there's that. So there's a protagonist who wants something, right? That's usually the main character. And then there's the antagonist that gets in their way. So when you're talking about a story, when you're talking about characters, you could say that. You could say something like Dorothy's a protagonist because she desires to get home. All the main action happens around her, and she constantly encounters the antagonist, which is the Wicked Witch, who puts these obstacles in her way to prevent her from getting what she wants. But at the end, Dorothy finds a way to get around the witch. In this case, really she melts her. And then she finds a way to get home. So other ones are the anti-hero, and the anti-hero is a character that you kind of want. Yes, Alan, thank you. Deadpool is definitely an anti-hero. They're just sometimes they don't have they're heroes, but they don't have the greatest values, or they there's something that's an evil streak to them as well. Maybe the way in which they do something is not the most orthodox way of doing something, or like you want to cheer for them, but then they do things that make you go, damn it, please, why did you do that? I believe we probably will read a story with an antihero in it called What You Pawn I Shall Redeem, and the antihero is a Native American called Jackson, and he's trying to get money to get an important, valuable ceremonial dress that belonged to his grandmother. And at every step, whenever he gets money, he loses it, spends it, or gives it away. And you're like, excuse me, don't you want your grandmother's regalia? But then anyway, so we'll deal more with that story when we get it. But that would be like an example of an anti-hero. A foil is any character right here, usually the antagonist or the important supporting character whose personal qualities contrast that of the main character, right? So the main character, the protagonist, is like Dorothy's a good person. She wants to do good in the world. She wants to be home. She loves her family. And the Wicked Witch just hates everything and wants to cause destruction. So they're usually the foil gets in the way of the antagonist. There's symbolic characters. Let's go back to Forrest Gump, right? The character Forrest Gump. Some of you saw the movie. Forrest Gump is also a symbolic character. Like he symbolizes innocence. He symbolizes earnestness. Like there's a innocence to him from day one that he doesn't know, but then it's profound because his innocence carries him to these incredible feats, right? So this is not necessarily a type of character, but this is more how we can learn about characters, right? So when you read, right, you say, what kind of character is this? And somebody will say, oh my God, they're nasty, they're, outspoken, they're this, or they may say, oh, she's a big woman and she's strong and she's, so how do you get that information? Like, how do you know that, right? Of course, from the story, right? You would know that information from the story. And so there's two kinds of representation, right? Yes, the Tiger of Pi, that's literally a symbolic character, Alan, the tiger and the Life of Pi, right? And I would say, if you can type it in the chat, what do you think it represented? What did it symbolize in the Life of Pi? I'll give you a second to type it while I talk about direct or indirect representation. Let's see. Yes, okay. Yes, it was almost like an internal battle, right? That was like the Life of Pi, a manifestation of ourselves, right? So That's a good example. So, so direct representation is when the writer tells you things that are about the character. It says they are angry, they're tall, they're 6'2", they're bald, right? They wear glasses and they're wearing a dark shirt. That's direct representation when the author tells you, right? Indirect representation is what you infer, like right from what is given in the text. So it may not say that they're angry, but if they said something like, let me pick the first name, Chantel is the first name I see on my student list. Chantel walked into the room and threw her brush against it and shattered her mirror. She began to cry and pound on the bed, right? So that's not telling you her emotional state. It's showing it to you, right? So you could say, oh my God, she's really upset. Maybe something happened. She's sad. She's hurt. She's crying. So you would be able to infer things about the character by the action and activities that is happening. Okay, so that's just a general kind of overview of what characters are. So we went over plot, right? That was the first thing we talked about. And that's like this, not only the sequence of events, but the cause and effect of events that happen, like the action that happens inside of a story. Then we talked about characters, and that's the second element that separates fiction from poetry, is that they're characters in these works. And we talked about the types of characters that they are so that you can be able to talk about them. And then the third thing is setting, right? And a lot of times setting, I have in the handout like place, excuse me. It's a place, right? Because it's a location, but it's more than that. The setting of a story is more than just the physical location where it takes place. Let's begin with the physical location. So that definitely takes place in a house, takes place in a city, takes place in a country, takes place. So the setting, like where the story happens, right? But setting also could be like the time of year it happens, right? Because it's different, right? If something happens in the winter or the summer, if the story is set on St. Valentine's Day or set on Independence Day, if the story takes place during a blizzard or during a heat wave, or so the time of year, can have an effect of it. The time of day, right? It was a dark and stormy night, right? That's a famous line for scary stories, right? It's letting you know that it's night, so it's dark, that it's dark and stormy, like it's a setting, right? The beginning of setting up the story. The setting is a dark and stormy night. So the time of day, things happen in the morning, in the afternoon, or it could be significant. Elapsed time, the amount of time that happens in the story, right? Forrest Gump spans like, I don't know, like 25 or 30 years, right, of his life, the time of day. Whereas, if you read, I'm trying to think, I forget the name of it, but there's also a movie that takes place, it's an old movie from the After Hours, takes place in one night, right? So the elapsed time, the mood and the atmosphere, right? If you read an Edgar Allan Poe story, the setting might be more gothic, or might be more dark or creepy, right? Or if something's humorous or something like that. So the mood and the atmosphere. Climate, I talked about time of year, but if it's snowing, if it's raining, if it's this dark and stormy night, right? Climate affects it. Geography, right? If something set in an island, in the Caribbean, in the Dominican Republic or Cuba or Haiti, or Puerto Rico, is different from the geography that will be in the mountains of any of those countries, but the mountains of the United States, or if you go to Canada. So sometimes if it's a desert, so all these things, contribute to it. Have your man-made geography, which is like, that Orchard Beach was created and didn't exist, but they made it, they created it. The eras of historical importance, if something takes place during, the civil rights movement in the 60s, or have here the gold rush in the 1800s, or the bubonic plague, or the pandemic, right? A story set during the pandemic could be the eras of historical importance, the socio-political and cultural climate, right? If something's taking place during the 60s, there's a lot happening. There was protests against the war. There was Civil Rights Act was passed in 64, but that was going on. 1969 was an important year, the Stonewall Revolution. So what happens socio and political could also affect the characters in the stories. Arab Spring, yes, that's another example of a socio-political moment, right? The population, right? If you set a story during the pandemic in New York City, or you set it somewhere in a rural town, it might have a different impact because of the population, right? And then there's, of course, ancestral influences. There's so many things that impact the setting or the location of a story. Plus, there are other elements to consider examining fiction, like and creative nonfiction as well, like difference of story structure, point of view, pacing, exposition, and dialogue, right? So another thing that separates it is that not all fiction works, but most fiction works have dialogue, characters, that the literal text and the language that the characters are using to talk to each other. So one other big concept in fiction, and this also relates to theater and drama, which we'll go to the section after this, after we do fiction, is dramatic story structure. Okay, so a story, this is not going to be so hopefully eye-opening to any of you. A story has a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? Okay, that's great. So we know we've got now plot, character, and setting, and there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? And the beginning is where things get set up. The middle is where the plot reaches the climax. So it's not always exactly in the middle, but climax is a turning point. And then the end where the plot is resolved, right? If there was something the person wanted, they achieved it. If they, didn't want it, they decided that they made peace and did away with whatever it is. Okay, and so that idea of a beginning, middle, and end was coined by a famous philosopher called Aristotle. And Aristotle has done many important things, but among them, this idea of beginning, middle, and end, right? The other thing, the kind of partner to build off of this idea of a beginning, middle, and end is the idea of, as what we're looking at as Freytag's dramatic structure. So the one we're using for Freytag is going to have 5 elements, 5 pieces to the structure, right? And so we're going to look at those elements here. We're going to look at them in this kind of triangular looking diagram. So if we look at the first part here, this is exposition. And the exposition is kind of like the setting up of the story, right? It was a dark and stormy night, right? That's a very simple beginning. A character walks into the room. They're wearing a robe. They're clutching it. It'll go on from there. The minute something happens in the story, they drop the candle and the carpet sets on fire. Boom, that would be like rising action, right? So suddenly the action in the story begins, right? And the character's trying to get out the house. They find an extinguisher, they find water, they throw water on it, they extinguish a little part of it. Suddenly the smoke is going and the smoke alarm goes off. They're looking for the smoke alarm. So the action keeps happening. And and then a climax happens, right? So this is what Aristotle calls the middle, and he calls it something when the climax happens is the middle of the story. So the climax basically is an activity or action that changes the course of the story, and usually that changes the course of a story for your main character. If I go back to The Wizard of Oz, and we got this young woman, Dorothy, who's in this land that she doesn't know. And what does she want? She wants to go home. She's got her antagonist, the witch, stopping her every step of the way from getting home, right? So, but once Dorothy dumps the bucket of water on the witch, and the witch melts and disappears, suddenly the obstacle is gone, and then the protagonist can move on. Right? So that's an example of a climax, something that happens in the story that changes the course of the story. Now, sometimes it's not always so clear to identify the climax in the story. Sometimes it's not so crystal clear. And sometimes people can make arguments for different parts, saying, no, I think this is the climax, because when this happens, this is how everything changes. But that's part of the fun as well of literature. The same way with poetry, we have interpretation. In some short stories, is very definitive and clear what the climax is, and in other stories, maybe not so much, right? So once Dorothy gets rid of the witch and she moves on, then that is the falling action, right, of the story, the falling action. Good question. I'm gonna I'm going to talk about juxtaposition and more than one climax. Usually, no. I'm going to say usually there isn't another. There's usually like one climax in the story, right? In the play that is normal. There are situations like, for instance, um, you know, and this is not necessarily another climax, but it's almost like a reigniting of the story, right? Um, I'm going to say this, Alan. So in terms of climax, it's usually just one in a story. That's usually the rule. There are exceptions where there's more than one. So that's different from two people disagreeing on whether this is the climax or that's the climax. Climax are pretty definitive, right? We know that Dorothy wants to get home. She overcome many obstacles in the way, but the most biggest obstacle, the obstacle that was keeping her from that, was clearly this witch. And once the witch is out of the story, that's clear. That's the climax, and she moves on. Someone may say that, when she gets home, it's the climax. That when, she meets the three people on the road, that's the climax. But you can make an argument how that's rising action because her life hasn't completely changed, and or she hasn't. It's in relationship to her want, and so that it's helping her toward her want. But once it doesn't give her the want, right? Those things don't are part of the want. And a part of it is also combating the witch. But once she gets the witch out of the way, so the answer is going to be, as a rule, no. There's usually just one climax, and in most stories and most plays, and but there are exceptions, right? And but the exception is different from two people having a debate about whether one element is the climax in the story and another element. Then the answer is like, whoa, there's two of them in the story. That's unusual. Usually that second climax is more like a reigniting of the story to the end of the story. Or it could be a secondary character. There's situations with that too. But as a rule, no. And juxtaposition, just so because you threw that in the chat, juxtaposition is when you're comparing two things that are happening side by side. So not quite sure what you were in terms of that you were referring to. But falling action after, if we stick with the Dorothy thing, the witch is gone. Dorothy goes back to the wizard. The wizard tells her, "Oh, you needed to do this to get home." And then the ending, the denouement, or the ending, which is kind of like, sometimes we want to say resolution, but it's exactly denouement's. I think a word that I love because it doesn't. I mean, just make it smaller because it's not about everything being resolved and tied up and being nice. Because sometimes denouements are not that neat. But here, it's the final part of a play. Here, I'm down here at this part, right? It's the final part of a play, a movie or story in which the strands of the plot are drawn together and the matter explained. The comedy ends with the protagonist better off than he or she was. The tragedy ends with a catastrophe in which the protagonist is worse off than he or she was. In the beginning, in stories, there's some kind of resolution that results from the activity in the story, right? So that's the denouement. So I have definitions of exposition, of rising action, of climax, falling action, and denouement, right? And then I do this whole thing with Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, examples that I've been using through this. This has more um, detail, but here the climax when she melts the witch, the falling action, and then ends with the appearance of Glenda, who sends her home, right? So I mentioned there's a couple of other elements of fiction. One is point of view, right? And so I'm just gonna pause a moment because that was to see if there's any questions on this, on Freytag's analysis of plot, of story, of dramatic structure. I know it's a lot of information. The beginning of a section is usually my least favorite because it's the one that it's just a lot of like info. But I want you to listen. I want you to take it in. The handout is there, right? The same way as the poetry of the elements of poetry handout will be there. So when we begin writing more about it, you can refer to this, right? So this is one way. I'll just talk about dramatic structure like this. This is one way you can describe a story. You can write an essay, right? Just describing the dramatic structure of a story, right? You could say, I'm going to look at the story called, yes. So good thing for the handout, Alan says, for sure. So one thing, so for instance, you could say your essay could be, I'm going to write, I'm going to examine the dramatic structure of the story, whatever story we're going to read, everyday use. And then you spit the beginning, the first element is, and in the dramatic structure includes exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and denouement. And then you would do that. You would say the exposition of the story begins with a mother and a daughter getting a yard together, waiting for the daughter to arrive. The minute the daughter arrived, the action begins to rise. So there's 3 points of rising action. One when D arrives, one when D wants the quilts, and one where D is taking pictures of the family. There's the climax of the story happens when the mother takes the quilts away from D, to whom she gave everything, and gives them to the other daughter, Maggie, who she never gave anything to. And then the falling action is D's upset. She leaves the house and she tells off her mother and her sister. And then the denouement is the mother and sister sit together in the yard, enjoying their peace, without D's histrionics, right? So you could write an essay just using the dramatic structure, right? You can write an essay examining the characters, doing a character analysis of your characters, right? You can write an essay examining the 3 elements of fiction, examining character, plot, and setting inside of a story. So, so in addition to helping us understand things with the story and dramatic structure, Freytech's triangle or Freytech's dramatic structure is helpful with that. Okay, so I'm going to move to point of view. Right. So stories are told in basically 4, but there's like in first person, in second person, or in third person. Most of the poetry read was first person. The way you could identify whether something's written in first person is because the person is using the word I. Like, I got up, I went to the store, I looked at my mother, and I asked her, what are you doing working at this store? And then I left and I went to school and I was embarrassed because now my mother is, not like a stay-at-home, whatever, but I am doing this. You're with the character, speaking from their point of view. I jump to third person. Third person is when not you're speaking. So instead of, so an example of I was speaking, right? I'm going to give you an example today of myself, me, from my first person point of view. I got up this morning. I did a little bit of yoga. I prepared for class. I made phone calls, and then I gave class. Right? That's me speaking from. That's right. If I was writing this down, it's from first person point of view. If we were going to write it in third person point of view, I would say Professor Charles Rice-Gonzalez rose from his bed. Then he did yoga. Then he prepped for class, and he made some phone calls, and he started his class. Right? So that's third person. I'm speaking as if I am somebody else. Right? So the point of view from the writer is that they're not in the I, they're in the other person's point of view. There's 2 kinds of point of view that are third person in literature. One is close, and that's when you write a character, but you stay with that character. So the novel that I wrote is written in third person point of view, close, right? Close perspective. That my main character is called Chulito. So you stay with Chulito through the whole story, right? Even though I'm saying Chulito got up, Chulito went to the store, Chulito did this, Chulito did that, Chulito cried, he rode the train, he did this. It's all about Chulito and what he did, but I stay with Chulito, right? Third person omniscient, right, is an even bigger third person point of view. So example that I said of Money, Mississippi, that book, Gathering the Waters. So that's an omniscient point of view, right? It's bigger. Omniscient means all knowing, right? And we attribute all knowing to like God. So it's almost like a God perspective. It really, you can see everything and talk about everything. You know what's happening in every character's brain, right? In a first person character's brain, if I'm speaking from I could talk about, let me go back to see the second student on my list. Chantelle, I used her as an example. Alan's next on the list. So if I'm writing a story from first person point of view, and I say, I'm talking to Alan and he's chatting back with me and we're doing this. And I said, I think he's really interested in this class. I could say that, right? But I don't know that. I may be judging it from his activity. Something else could be going on in Alan's head that has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. So that's a limitation of first person. Like you only know from that perspective what the person is thinking and feeling. And that character can infer what someone else, but unless somebody tells them, they don't know for sure. Omniscient, the person can talk about both points of view. Charles is doing his thing. Alan is upset. He's this. It can go back and forth. So that's first person and second person. First person and third person, the two kinds of third person. The other one is second person, the fourth kind. So there's first person, there's third person. That's two different, one, close and omniscient, and then there is second person. And second person also is used a lot in poetry. The second person puts you in the position, right? You as the reader. So when the text will use things like, you get up in the morning, you look out the window, you prep for your class, you did your yoga, right? You made your phone calls, and you started your class. That's the word "you" is used in there. So when it's talking as if to the reader, we will definitely read stories that are in first person, in second person, and in third person point of view. The second person stories is a story by a writer named Junot Diaz, and he starts, you have this girlfriend named Alma. So he's talking about you as a reader. He's addressing you, the reader. He didn't say, I have a girlfriend named Alma. And he didn't say, there's this person, this character who has a girlfriend named Alma, right? So that's second person. Exposition, we've mentioned it in Freytag's triangle, right? Exposition, right? And that's like the beginning, the setup of the story. But exposition has another meaning in literature. And exposition is when you are telling people what is happening, right? It usually happens in the beginning, but exposition is when you tell the information, right? You say, let me look here. There's another function of exposition. Writing classes, they say show, don't tell, but the show part is the action and the tell part is the exposition. Exposition is the act of explaining, right? Essentially, the exposition is information essential to understand the work when used effectively. So if you're hearing drilling, I'm sorry, they're doing construction in the building. And the next time you see me, my background may be different because they're moving me to a different apartment. So because they've started this major construction thing right underneath my apartment. So exposition, right? It's the explaining. It's important, right? Whoops. Excuse me. Let's see if it's So the other element is dialogue, and I mentioned that a little bit. That's literally the talking that characters do. They're usually in quotation marks, and then you'll see what they say. Get off my porch. I will not get off your porch. Yes, you will get off my porch, or I will call the authorities. Call the authorities. I have every right to be here. So the conversation, the dialogue that the characters are having is literally a part of it. And then I have something here called pacing, and we'll talk more about pacing another time. Okay. So at the end of your handout, there is a tiny story, right? Yes, it's a lot of dialogue. So here's a very short fiction story. It is 2 paragraphs. So I'm going to read this story to all of you, and we're going to talk about it next class, right? But I'm just going to read the story. It's by George Saunders, classic American writer. Here it goes. Sticks by George Saunders. Every year, Thanksgiving night, we flocked out behind Dad as he dragged the Santa suit to the road and draped it over a kind of crucifix he'd built out of a metal pole in the yard. Super Bowl week, the pole was dressed in a jersey and Rod's helmet, and Rod had to clear it with Dad if he wanted to take the helmet off. On the 4th of July, the pole was Uncle Sam. On Veterans Day, a soldier. On Halloween, a ghost. The pole was Dad's only concession to glee. We were allowed a single Crayola from the box at a time. One Christmas Eve, he shrieked at Kimmy for wasting an apple slice. He hovered over us as we poured ketchup, saying, "Good enough, good enough, good enough." Birthday parties consisted of cupcakes, no ice cream. The first time I brought a date over, she said, "What's with your dad and that pole?" And I sat there blinking. We left home, married, had children of our own, found the seeds of meanness blooming also within us. Dad began dressing the pole with more complexity and less discernible logic. He draped some kind of fur over it on Groundhog Day and lugged out the floodlight to ensure shadow. When an earthquake struck Chile, he laid the pole on its side and spray painted a rift in the earth. Mom died, and he dressed the pole as death and hung from the crossbar photos of Mom as a baby. We stop by and find talismans from his youth arranged around the base, army medals, theater tickets, old sweatshirts, tubes of Mom's makeup. One autumn, he painted the pole bright yellow. He covered it with cotton swabs the winter for warmth and provided offspring for hammering by hammering in 6 cross sticks around the yard. He ran the length of string between the pole and the sticks and taped to the string letters of apology, admissions of error, pleas for understanding, all written in a frantic hand on index cards. He painted a sign saying love and hung it from the pole, and another that said forgive. And then he died in the hall with the radio on, and we sold the house to a young couple who yanked up the pole and the sticks and left them by the side of the road on garbage day. Okay, so that is George Saunders' Sticks. Here there's some review questions, right? Can you identify, discuss the elements of fiction, character, plot, and setting? In terms of dramatic structure, can you identify and explain the climax of the story? And from what point of view is the story told, right? So let's look at the story one more time, right? So it says every year, let's look at the last question. From what point of view is the story told? I'm just going to read the first paragraph, and then I'm going to ask you to either put it in the chat or unmute. So remember, first person point of view, second person, third person point of view. Every year, Thanksgiving night, we flocked out behind Dad as he dragged the Santa suit to the road, and draped it over a kind of crucifix he'd built out of a metal pole in the yard. Super Bowl week, the pole was dressed in a jersey, and Rod's helmet, and Rod had to clear it with Dad if he wanted to take the helmet off. On the 4th of July, the pole was Uncle Sam. On Veterans Day, a soldier. On Halloween, a ghost. The pole was Dad's only concession to glee. We were allowed a single Crayola from the box at a time. One Christmas Eve, he shrieked at Kimmy for wasting an apple. He hovered over us as we poured ketchup, saying, good enough, good enough, good enough. Birthday parties consisted of cupcakes, no ice cream. The first time I brought a date over, she said, what's with your dad and that pole? And I sat there blinking. What point of view do you think the story is being told in? First person, second person, third person? You can type it in the chat. You can take a chance. Let's see. Alan wrote second. You're letting Alan do all the work? Okay, there you go. Kayla, first person. Viviano, first person.
I say first also.
Okay, Carissa, thanks. Yeah, so first person, Rifa. So those of you, it seems that first seems to be the consensus, and Alan is asking if it's second with a question mark if it's second. So any of you who said it was first, what indicated that it's first person to all of you, to any of you?
The use of we and
the use of
yeah.
Yeah. Right at the very end, he says, I sat there blinking. So we know that there is a person speaking, and they're speaking from that point of view, from their own personal experience, right? So that's the point of view in which the story is told in, right? So I'm going to ask you one question about character, right? So tell me about the father. What do you know from that first paragraph? What do you know about the father? How would you describe the father? Let's see. First response. Strict yet caring. Yes. Right? Definitely strict, the father, right? There's lots of examples, like he only gave them one crayon, that he didn't let them use a lot of ketchup. It's like, kind of hovered over them, right? He says. And then Viviano adds odd, right? And so I think I'm going to take a leap and say that Viviano's saying odd because, there's something unusual about this the stick that the father puts in the yard, almost like, if you build a snowman, right? But instead you have sticks in the yard, and that you start dressing it up for the holidays. And even that last line, the first time I brought a date over, she said, "What's with your dad and that pole?" And I sat there blinking, right? So if you just look at that tiny little paragraph, there's so much more you can learn about the father, but that would be an example of indirect representation, right? Indirect characterization. They're not telling you that he's odd or that he's, caring or that he's strict. But you get that from the activity and the action, right? So for your homework, you will answer the third question, right? And we can do more if you want to do more with the can you identify other elements like plot, character, and setting. We're going to talk about that on Wednesday. But for your homework, I'm going to ask you to identify, in terms of the dramatic structure, identify the climax of the story, right? So that's one part, to read the story, and then what is the climax and why, right? Remember, the climax is when something changes, and it's usually to the protagonist, right? That's one. And then two is to read another story called A and P, and to answer a question. I'm just going to go over here. I'm going to move it to the top, but in the discussions, I'll move this up to the top because I know you're all working on your essays for tonight, but for Tuesday. So here, for Sticks by George Saunders, in terms of dramatic structure, can you identify and explain the climax of the story, include an example from the text? And for A and P by John Updike, that's the other story, can you identify the climax of the story, include an example from the text? Also, can you identify, describe, and give an example of one other element of fiction, right? So at this point, it could be anything like character, plot, or setting. It could be point of view. It could be dialogue. And all of those are elements of fiction. So that's your homework for right before class by noon on Wednesday, so that we can then discuss both Sticks and A and P in class. Okay. So that's it. That's your homework. You remember A and P. Okay, cool. That's your homework. I'm going to move it up to the top, so that you can see it. Is due by noon on Wednesday. And I look forward to beginning reading your essays on poetry. And I'm going to pause now and see if there's any questions that you have regarding, I'll put it on top here. If you have any questions regarding the essay or any questions regarding the assignment, that's going to be due by noon on Wednesday. I will pause. Oh, where can I find the A&P story? So now if you go to course content here in your class, right, you have now a fiction folder. You will open your fiction folder, and in it lists all the stories, and A&P is the first one right on top. Okay, you can click A&P and you should be able to see it. Okay, there's the A&P story. It's not that long, a couple pages. Okay. Any other questions? I'm going to come into the class, stop sharing. Let me do the speaker view. Okay. So yeah, so if any of you have questions about the assignment or about, the essay that's due tonight, for the rest of you who are writing it, do your best, hit your home runs if you can, go for it. I think a lot of you did really well in your last assignment, so you should be in a good place to excel in your poetry essay. And if there are no more questions, then you know what to do. You say, good afternoon, adios, take care, goodbye, professor, see you next class. Any of those things in the chat, and that will record your attendance.
So bye-bye, professor.
Okay, take care.
Bye.
And if you have a question, you can write in the chat or unmute. It's a good question. There was what point of view that you're writing the essay. I didn't give you any direction on that, so it's okay to use whichever point of view you'd like. I will prefer third person point of view. And so going after the poetry essay, that'll be an instruction. but otherwise, whatever point of view you wrote your essay in, your poetry essay is fine. First person or third person.
Okay, thank you, Professor.
You're welcome, Lindsay. You type these two students, so if you don't, Dana, if you don't have a question, I'm just writing your name in the chat, so I know you were here, and I'll see you Wednesday. Okay. She left. Okay.